Okay, who brought the dog? Hey, so we're doing this series, and I want you to say this a lot because we're going to say this quite a bit because it's my favorite. Say, who invited Jesus? Yeah, who invited Jesus? I love these questions that get involved. If you would, please turn to John chapter 2. We're going to read it here in just a little bit. And a fun piece of information, my John 2 starts on 1799, but it only has one line. And then I have to turn a page. So I will turn the instant I start reading. But we'll get there in a second. At the very dawn of time, there resided the complete embodiment of God's passion, wisdom, and logic. It dwelled in perfect harmony with God, and it also was God. And through this very essence, the cosmos sprung into being, a magnificent tapestry of all things that would come to be. And within this reality, life pulsated forward, and its brilliance pierced into a shroud of seemingly endless darkness. Behold, the complete embodiment of God's fullness assumed human form, and we were privileged to witness in its splendor. The solitary Son of God, adorned with robes and grace and truth. A man, later named John, stepped onto the stage of history, a forerunner of this herald of God's brilliance that was to come. The torchbearer, shining light on this path, announcing of God's presence, the human truth of God's radiance. Jesus himself would grace our world, yet was also the world. This human form of God's wisdom and logic did not remain aloof in divine realms. Instead, it donned the mantle of humanity and walked among us, journeying through the dusty byways of Galilee. And through this light, we glimpse the weight and beauty of the Father's essence and presence in this glory bathed in multiple hues and love and redemption. Moses, the great lawgiver, bequeathed the law to the ancestors, but grace and truth flowed forth from the heart of Jesus Christ. No mortal eye had fully glimpsed the face of God, but the Son nestled close to the Father's heart, unveiling him to our hearts. The Word had become flesh and dwelt among us, and John the Baptist had revealed this incarnate Word and the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, even sending his own disciples to follow after Jesus. Then, in the last stage of preparation for ministry, Jesus gathers to himself and the beginnings of all of his disciples, and with further preparation, Jesus begins the close work of the things that was to come. While he still might expect that Jesus would come and choose to make a big kind of splash in the launch of public ministry, Jesus nevertheless performs the first miraculous sign to manifest his glory not from the temple in Jerusalem, but from a wedding feast in the backwater town of Galilee, where a bridegroom had run out of wine. John opens up this high bar in his gospel that takes us to the pinnacle mountaintops of understanding Trinitarian theology, this giant understanding that we are beholding God, not just a man, when Jesus enters the scene. And that is why this wedding is so strange. Because the first chapter of John establishes Jesus as God wrapped in flesh. This incarnate, eternal being come walk on this world. And in chapter 2, we go from this divinity, this incarnate God wrapped up in himself. We go from that suddenly to chapter 2, and we're slammed into the middle of a party that's run out of liquor. How do you go from the divinity of that to the Cupid shuffle? It's the Jesus we saw sitting on the circle of the earth with all the power in his hand, watching the cosmos being pushed into being, now hangs out on the side wall of a party. It's almost oxymoronic. It's the yin and the yang, this divine and the natural. The next time that we see Jesus, he's not God wrapped up in flesh, he's hanging out at a reception. This weird wedding at Cana doesn't seem to fit with this auspicious power that John has given us in chapter 1. It wouldn't be the way I would chronologically choose to discuss the things in chapter 1. Suddenly in chapter 2, it stands out that the lofty peaks suddenly become this strange human valley. In this abyss space of chapter 2, the problem that this great incarnate Jesus encounters is that people have run out of wine. What do we even know about the wedding at Cana? If you ever go to Jerusalem, and if you're in this area, You're taken to what is known as the traditional site of Cana, just Kirf Cana, you don't need to know that. It's near Nazareth on this road, near this Franciscan mountain. The problem is that this location doesn't have any Roman period ruins and is most likely not the place mentioned in the New Testament. The veneration of this spot came much later in the Middle Ages. Some alternative sites have been suggested, all these different areas, high on valleys and all these different spots, but no location really has any evidence to say, hey, this was Cana. The Mark and the other writers of the Gospels don't know anything about Cana. John mentions it again a few times around trips to Judea, but there's some trouble with this place because no one seems to know exactly where it was. All that to say, Cana was some backwater town that history itself didn't bother to preserve. The high marks of John 1, the incarnate God, this thing, suddenly story takes place in a town no one bothered to keep track of at a wedding. Like so much of the Gospel of John, the story at the wedding at Cana is this curious luminescence about it when you read it, almost this dreamlike quality, where every detail and gesture and suggests some piece of presence that exists beyond this meaning, where there's this sort of ritual stateliness in this detail. Their faces melt into one another. The voices speak words that are often elusive, but indistinguishable with some sort of significance. Here, this strange, dreamy story from John chapter 2. Are you ready? On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to this wedding. And when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each one holding about 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," so that they were filled to the brim. And then he said to them, "Draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. And he didn't realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now." What Jesus did here in Cana at Galilee was the first of his signs, through which he revealed his glory, and the disciples believed him. And after this, they went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. We're going to do this story over the next 4 weeks, so we're going to look at just little sections. Are you ready to hear what today's section is about? Repeat after me. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana. That's what today's sermon is about, right? One more time. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana. Wow. I'm going to get 20 minutes out of this, guys. I hope you're ready. Those are the 10 words of the text this morning. It's not the water. It's not the wine. It's not Mary petitioning Jesus. It's not filling the jugs. It's not the best for last. That might come later, like saving the best for last. But just there's a wedding on the third day. So first of all, let's talk about the wedding. Hey, whose wedding is it? We don't know. The bridegroom isn't named. The bride isn't mentioned. All we know is that Mary was there, Jesus was there, and his little group of friends were there with him. In a little town no one cared to remember. But we also know that this picture of the wedding would become a significant little teaching moment for our writer of John. He tells people the story of being invited into a wedding who decide not to come, that make excuses. He tells stories of men that turn up at weddings wearing incorrect clothing. He tells of wise and foolish bridesmaids that make preparations, and those that didn't make preparations for the wedding. When criticized for not fasting, he asked whether wedding guests should be expected to mourn while the bridegroom was with them, casting himself in the role of the bridegroom, which echoes some of Isaiah, comparing God to this bridegroom married to the Israelite people. John the Baptist said that when he compared himself to the best man he could think of, Jesus being this groom. Paul said the same when he compares Jesus to a husband, a loving and cherished bride as a church. John wrote of the marriage of the supper of the Lamb and of the city of God coming down in heaven with a bride adorned for her husband. And in the background of every one of these passages is this wedding symbolism that was written in the old scrolls for Song of Solomon that John picks up on. A wedding, then, was a very powerful little picture in the Bible of the love of God for his people, and that Christ has for the church, this community of disciples, this very picture of a life of joy and celebration and festivity with God at the center of all of it that we're called to. There was a wedding at Cana. Whose? We don't know. Why Cana? Who knows? It's like getting married in South Whitley. Who would do that, you know? It's like, in 100 years, who knows? And that Jesus was there. So the scene is set for a story about Jesus, and certainly one that takes command of an occasion, the bringer of festivity, the herald of joy. As John tells us in the story, it's not a spiritual joy that Jesus is going to bring, but a very down-to-earth joy and an unexpected quality and quantity of wine to come later. But the other half of this little 10 words for today, on the third day. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana. The third day of what? Well, if you jump backwards a little bit into John chapter 1, you'll see that Jesus is on the move with his disciples in Judea and then in Galilee. This is our day 1. Then the next, and now on the third day, they're at this wedding at Cana. A couple things have happened now this third day of this journey. But it's hard to read those words, on the third day, without hearing a little bit of a rattling in our ear of other things it reminds us of. It's of course on the third day that this wedding takes place, like when Abraham took Isaac to be sacrificed on the third day of their journey, or when God gave Israel commandments on Mount Sinai when Moses returns down after the third day. King David rescued his family from the Amalekites on the third day. Hezekiah was restored to health and worshipped on the third day. Hosea tells the exiles in captivity that they would be revived on the third day. Esther went before the king to intercede for the people on the third day of the celebrations. It was, of course, the third day that Jesus comes then to change water into wine. And in the way of dreams, the number 3 calls up the other third day. We're just at daybreak. In another way, towards the very end, Jesus would change despair into rejoicing again. At the very end of the gospel story, there will be a third day where the human failure and the mishap and disasters are put correct, when God retrieves the situation and saves the day, when the bringer of festivity and joy returns from the dead and a new wedding feast begins. I love John. So this backwater village wedding with its tale of failure and redemption is an anticipation John has given us of a day of the resurrection to come later in his story. The last day, when the marriage feast of the Lamb has come and the city of God comes down from heaven as a bride adored for her husband. Jesus first manifests this glory, his auspicious giant beginnings of chapter 1 here at this little wedding village in the middle of the human preoccupation, this preparations, the plans, the expectations that were built up and dashed and muddled in failure and sorrow and joy. This is where Jesus shows up. If you've ever been in charge of putting on a wedding or participating in a wedding, that line rings super true. In the middle of the human preoccupation, the preparations, the plans, and the expectations that you hope are not dashed. I do premarital counseling, and I tell people, just remember, the worst thing that happens at the end of the day is that you got married. That's supposed to be funny. Right? I remember what we ate at our wedding. I remember I didn't eat any of it. I remember we didn't have any alcohol at our wedding, and my brothers snuck next door to the other reception and bought alcohol at that wedding and came over. I remember trying to think with Ashley, did we get to every single table to say hi to every person that was there? Did we get a chance to speak to everyone? I remember trying to build the decorations up the day before and putting them together. In the middle of the human preoccupation, Jesus should show up at the wedding at some point. And the story of this miracle at Cana takes place among other gospel stories that tells us the presence of Christ in the very down-to-earth moments. Jesus on the road to Emmaus, at a lakeside, his own words that we'll find him among the poor, the naked, the sick, the homeless, those that are in prison. It takes place alongside the whole of the Christmas story in the backwater town of Bethlehem in a stable. The mystery of the Word made flesh, tabernacled. It takes place in the mystery of the Eucharist, a bread and wine transfigured to be living body and lifeblood. Archbishop William Temple describes Christianity as the most materialistic of religions in a good way. This is what he meant, that there is nothing of earth, of God's creation, of which is not also a sign of heaven, of God's recreation of this space. Christian artists and poets have described the same thing. Some have said, what about Christ in Cookham? Francis Thompson placed him not in Gennesareth, but in the Thames River. One of the poets, Geoffrey Kennedy, imagined when Christ came into Birmingham. The world is changed and charged with the grandeur of God, but we need the eyes to see it. To find Christ's presence in the whatsoever. On the roads and beside the lake and rivers, at our wedding feasts and at supper tables, and in the faces of those we turn to for help. We need those poets and artists' eyes more than you can think, those eyes of faith that sometimes we have lost, even now more than ever. See, for most of us, me in particular, I write these for me first before you. Other people have more acuity for this. It feels like a wedding where the wine has run dry. A place where joy has evaporated. I look around, I can't see it anymore. It's gray. But there's still an effort for many of us to say the world is charged with God's grandeur if I'm willing to see it. To see the manifesting in our day-to-day lives. With those that are so beset by sickness and loneliness and anxiety for anything to return to what seems to be normal. But that's, of course, the point the gospel story makes. It's precisely in this backwater, here and now, gray nothingness, beset by the loneliness and anxiety for a longing of normalcy, that the presence of Christ appears. And not in some spruced up reality like chapter 1, or some sacred arena or giant temple, or some otherworldly location, but here, in this normal moment in a town no one cares about. In Columbia City, if you would, in the year 25. In the poverty of our own nature, we can't see the riches of God's grace. In the mishaps of failures, we try to taste the wine of Christ's presence. A wedding that almost flopped, except for this strange, stern guest, worked a miracle to turn it into the best wedding of all. And so this begs for me the question of the entire text to set it off, that I read through commentaries and I look everywhere in I have all these notes and I read books and I ask other pastors and no one has a good answer for it at all. And it's the question I ask you today is, who the crap invited Jesus to this wedding? He wasn't performing the wedding. It's in a nowhere town he's got no relationship to. Who? Yeah, some people have suggested the wedding at Cana was this. We'll get to that one. This was Jesus' wedding. I'll let that one sit for a minute. I find it unlikely. Even though the account is pretty allegorical and it comes to us from John, it's hard to derive any historical material from it. Jesus shows up with all his disciples, with his mother and brother already there. It's probably a wedding for somebody else. Other people have suggested it's one of his sisters or brother's wedding, since Mary is there and so concerned with the happenings. Since the wedding is held in Cana, it could be one of the disciples of Jesus's, maybe one of his brothers, or a sister or a daughter of Nathanael, one of the later disciples. But we don't know. No one's bothered to ask this question or think it through at any capacity really deeply. Nothing exists anywhere in the text to tell us why he was there. All we know is that he was there. When we were fresh out of college, we were invited to his wedding, to he and his wife's wedding, right after college. It was in downtown Indianapolis. It was going to be just great. He bought us all ties that had IU logos on them. We were all set and ready to go, and we were going to be the ushers for this wedding. We were real excited about it. So we get to the practice, to usher, we get told, how to do it. And there's this strange interaction with some of the extended family. And we began to notice we may be the only people in this entire wedding that went to college. Nobody else was there. And I remember sitting with and saying, it would be funny if at the reception our table wasn't even in there. So we get to downtown Indianapolis where the reception is. And we look in the thing for our names for the table, and our names aren't on the list for a table. So we go table to table, looking, and hey, is this? And that's when, at the corner of my eye, I notice some of the people who worked the venue were putting up another table in the hallway. And you'll never guess whose table it was. It was ours. There's a picture on my Facebook for anyone bored enough of us sitting at this table looking through a doorway into the reception for it. We were invited to the wedding, but were we? Do you see me? You picture it with me? We were invited, but were we invited? I don't think so. Right? The miracle, the sign, the ministry, whatever you want to call it for Jesus in this Gospel of John begins only because Jesus wasn't just invited. He was invited into the wedding. He didn't have to sit at a table outside. He's close enough to the life of whoever the bride or groom was that an invitation was sent and a table was prepared for him to sit at. He was brought into the room. And that is the first challenge that John gives us at this wedding of Cana. The first challenge this pericope gives us. Who invited Jesus? Are we in relationship enough to actually put a table up to begin the work of the rest of the wedding? It only happens because he was there. Have we really truly invited Jesus into the situation, or put a table up on the outside, expecting his action to take place outside of our view? Come and follow me is the call given by God, this prevenient grace that reaches out to us first. On one hand, it seems like a really simple invitation. And yet, when you understand the implications, it demands a radical response. Because it's easy to put a table up for the people you invited the last second. But to put the table close enough to the bride and groom to make action is the difficult part. Are you willing to push the room aside to trust Jesus and follow him, leaving the ways of the world, or what your mother-in-law says your table should be arranged as? Colin Rainey, talking to you. To follow him and leave behind this world of fear, hatred, and violence. To follow and seek something more than just the superficial pursuits and the pleasures that exist outside of the world. Are you willing to follow, to set aside your destructive habits and different ways and cast aside the lives of guilt and regret? Because that invitation is intimidating. But something beautiful, as the rest of the text gives us, to live in a world without belonging to it, as Henry Nouwen says. That summarizes the essence of the spiritual life. The spiritual life that keeps us aware our true houses are not the house of fear, but which the powers of hatred and violence are kicked out, and the house of love rules where God resides. I love Henry Nouwen. It begins by allowing yourselves to know of Jesus in some way, that you respond to this act of grace, that it invites Jesus into your lives, even the most mundane, like a wedding with no liquor, to be the Lord of it all. It begins with this invitation. A life that flops and strays with no defined direction, except suddenly this strange, stern guest enters in and works a miracle. And it turns out that invitation was the best decision ever made. Who invited Jesus? May we be the ones that accept and send out. Let's pray.